You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Emily Laflamme of the Center for Neighborhood Technology in Chicago. Emily chats about the Elevated Works Technical Assistance Program that helps developers bring Equitable TOD to life. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super wonderful, terrific, amazing Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of city wizards and transportation experts, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. We've also got some bonus material up there, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, the heavyweight net bike scarf is back in stock. I'm also going to make a concerted effort to make some new designs, but if you want to get one of the Buster Bike scarves or the Lightweight Bike scarf now, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. And if you'd like to support the show in other ways, you can buy books at the bookshop site, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire, or find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarcholesterol. For anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook, visit theoverheadwire.com and definitely sign up for the almost 20-year-old daily newsletter. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that too. You can also find us on Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's Transit Nerds. Some great stuff coming up, so keep on listening and enjoy the show. A quick note for Patreon supporters. I've set up an ad-free podcast RSS feed at Patreon. This means if you want to listen to the show without ads or promotional episodes in your podcatcher of choice, you can do so by heading over to your Patreon account and getting the feed there. I'll post instructions in the show notes of how to do it. And if you aren't a Patreon supporter, you can do so by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Even just $1 a month gets you our podcast free of outside ads. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Emily Laflamme, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I am based here in Chicago. I work for the Center for Neighborhood Technology. We're a nonprofit that's been around for about 40 years. We focus our work on supporting community-based organizations and local governments, really to create neighborhoods that are sustainable, thriving, and resilient.
So tell me, how did you first get interested in cities, transportation, urban planning, that type of stuff?
My background is actually in public health. I have a master's degree in public health. And as I was working in the public health space, I realized pretty quickly that one of the things that impacts our health the most is where we live. And it's how we get around, if we have access to safe and affordable housing and the environments that we live in. And so my work started increasingly creeping towards urban planning. And now I find myself sitting at this intersection between how we design and plan urban spaces, thinking about that as a tool to improve health and health equity. When city design works well, you don't have to think about it. And when city design doesn't work well, then you notice exactly where it doesn't work well. So I think as I grew up, I had the language or to understand, here are the parts of city design that allowed me to live a healthy life. And here are the parts, that I want to continue to work to improve.
So it's interesting. I mean, Dr. Minnie Fullilove has been on the show before, and I was just writing recently about, the biopsychosocial model versus the biomedical model. And I find that very fascinating from a public health perspective, but also from a planning perspective, thinking about how the social determinants of health throughout a whole neighborhood, determine your well-being. Like, you just go to the hospital to get treated for that specific item, but it starts way before that in the neighborhood you live, the people you're surrounded by, the social networks you have. And so that the root shock idea that she put together really kind of stuck in my head, but also, thinking about those two models and how they complement each other, but also there's a lot of folks that only think about the one biomedical model and they don't necessarily consider the biopsychosocial model.
Yeah, that's right. Everything in your neighborhood impacts your health, and we can prevent a lot of illness and disease by investing upstream and in what we call the root causes of health, things like transportation and housing and mental health, food access, social connection, all of that.
Well, so we're here to talk about ETOD, but first off, for those who may not be familiar with the jargon, we are jargon filled here on the show, but ETOD, where did it come from?
It's an acronym, stands for Equitable Transit Oriented Development. And the concept of transit oriented development has been around for a long time, or TOD. And TOD is a concept, quite simply, you should build close to public transit, and there's many benefits of doing that. Connects folks across neighborhoods, takes advantage of a great city resource, and it's good for the environment. Gets folks out of cars and using an accessible and environmentally friendly mode of transportation. What we've seen in Chicago, where I'm based, and in many other cities, is that TOD without the E, or the equity focus, or the intentional connection to equity, is that TOD follows a lot of the same historic patterns of investment and disinvestment. And in Chicago, we saw after our TOD ordinance was passed many years ago that incentivized development near transit. A lot of it happened in very wealthy, predominantly white neighborhoods. And that got folks talking about the need for this intentional equity lens. So, ETOD is this concept where we are trying to make sure that development near transit benefits everyone, not just in wealthy communities. And that can look a bunch of different ways. There's not one way that ETOD looks like, but it can really at its root be for the people who live in the neighborhood, serving them, not displacing them. So that can be a grocery store, that can be a daycare, that can be affordable housing, that can be community space, it can be small businesses. But the point is that the process includes some acknowledgement of what communities need.
It's so interesting because for the last 20 years, I've been focused on transit-oriented development. The conversation has changed to a certain extent, and even before I started thinking about it, there were many others. Obviously, the started out with Peter Calthorpe and the folks that did work in Oregon and other places. But it's interesting that at the beginning, it was trying to get people to realize that the development near transit was a thing at all. And now it's evolved into something that's even more important, which is the equitable part. And I'm wondering about that kind of evolution because the discussion has changed over time. And so I'm curious about your thoughts about how that happened and, what's the importance of the change in discussion since, like I said at the start, we were only trying to get people to realize that it was okay to develop near transit. And now we found out what happens when you only allow certain developments in certain neighborhoods along certain transit lines.
Right. Development near transit starts from acknowledging that transit is an asset and an important part of how folks get around a city. And I think research over time has shown how beneficial it is to live close to transit and the job access and access to other amenities that brings. When transit oriented development happens without an equity lens, folks notice. And we see these patterns where investment is happening only in some neighborhoods. And what happened in those neighborhoods is that this kind of development then can raise prices, can lead to displacement of folks who have lived in those neighborhoods for a long time. And on the other hand, in areas where there's historically been disinvestment, when there are all of these incentives that are coming to encourage development near transit, but that development is not happening in certain neighborhoods, we see a lot of community response to that. And ETOD is part of that community response that when we're incentivizing development across our city and when we're trying to maximize the benefit of a publicly owned and invested in asset like public transit, that should be for everyone. And so ETOD comes out of that, the evolution of how we're thinking about transit oriented development and now equitable transit oriented development is coming from this, ground up community led idea that investments in our cities should benefit everyone.
So back in 2019, we talked with Kendra Freeman about ETOD in Chicago, and it's something that's been the focus of the group, Elevated Chicago. But a lot has happened since 2019. So I'm wondering if you give us kind of a catch up of like what's happened since that time period. Obviously, we had a pandemic in there, but I imagine that your group and others have been focused on advancing the cause.
That's right. So Elevated Chicago is a coalition of partners, including the Center for Neighborhood Technology, other nonprofits, community-based organizations, and representatives from our local government. And Elevated Chicago has been around since 2017, advocating for equitable transit-oriented development. Since 2019, one of the major policy efforts passed the Connected Communities Ordinance, which passed in Chicago in 2022. And this was an update to Chicago's zoning code to make it easier to build near transit. So there were density bonuses, parking requirement reductions, and other zoning related incentives for transit oriented development. And then, speaking of the pandemic, and the American Rescue Plan infused a bunch of funding into the recovery from the pandemic. And the city of Chicago did a great job in recognizing that ETOD could be one of the tools to help Chicago recover from the pandemic. And through that program, set aside $5 million in grants to ETOD developers and funding as well for a technical assistance program to support those developers.
So let me hear more about the technical assistance program, because I found that one of the most interesting things about what you all been doing.
For the last 2.5 years, we've been running a technical assistance program in partnership with the city of Chicago and the ETOD grants that I just mentioned to support developers throughout the development process working on their ETOD project. One of the criteria to participate in our program was that the development project needed to be near transit and it needed to have one of the principles of equitable transit oriented development baked into their project. And if they were selected to participate, they received a grant from the city and they were eligible to participate in our technical assistance program. Many of these developers, this was their first time ever doing a development. And our TA program brought together 18 professionals with expertise in real estate development, zoning, community engagement, architecture, urban design, transportation planning, communications, and we were able to work with these developers through the last 2 years to address any challenges that came up and support with system navigation, just kind of moving through Chicago's development project process to ensure the success of these projects.
Why were these developers wanting to get in when they were newbies? I mean, that's a hard thing to do, right? Getting in on the ground floor of development. It seems like something that's very gate kept and hard to start.
Right. It's a really complicated process. Maybe not everyone, but many of us, I think, have walked down the street and seen a vacant lot or a vacant building and thought, oh, wouldn't it be cool if something was there? Or you're a small business owner and you've operated out of your basement and you're thinking, it would really be great to have a physical location. And I think many people get to that point and many people stop at that point because you just don't have the connections or the resources to even know what your next step might be. And so this program was really trying to be the support to help people jump over that hurdle and demystify the whole process and connect folks who may not have the connections to these various professionals.
I mean, development is a very capital intensive thing. And I mean, I did that when I was in college too. I saw a property in Austin that I was like, oh, that would be a really cool place for a TOD. But I went around asking people like, well, how do you do this? How do you get money? Like, how do you put together a capital plan? And I talked to an architect and I was like, I'd love to do a development on this property. And he's like, oh, okay. He's like, how much money do you have? I was like, I don't have any money. So it's one of those things that, that's kind of the gate that you have to walk through is like getting money to do these projects. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that too, is like access to capital, but also what brings a developer in who wants to do a development, who might want a grocery store or something along those lines on the property, but also to think about equitable TOD or seek you all out to want to do something different than the status quo.
The way we think about what it takes for an ETOD project to be successful is that you need a policy environment that supports this kind of work. And the Connected Communities Ordinance in Chicago got us closer to that. You need capital. And for many of the small emerging developers that we worked with, that is a combination of personal savings, grants from government, grants from philanthropy, donations from friends and family, small loans from banks. It's a whole cobbled together capital stack. And also, then this technical assistance piece, which is the system navigation and support to help get those projects going. And part of the technical assistance is support on the capital. And it's both finding the capital and the timing of the capital, because those sources that I just mentioned don't all come in together, and many of them are reliant on each other. And so, one of the things that was really important about this project, many of these projects were pre development, which meant they were at stage one. Some of them were at the ideation phase. The fact that the city of Chicago had equitable TOD pre development grants and put that money in was a flag for other funders to say, this is a project that we're backing, and that can help find additional capital sources. And then on the technical assistance side, we did a lot of work with developers, reviewing their pro forma, reviewing their sources, reviewing their costs, and revising them as things changed, and providing coaching on the timing of, when to approach various potential funders.
What kind of technical assistance did developers ask for? What types of specific things did they need to know more about?
One of the things that I think worked really well with this program is that we partnered with the real estate solutions team at IFF. They are experts in understanding real estate development, and they served as a hub for all of our technical assistance services. At the beginning of the program, they met with each of the developers to understand more about the project and what their needs might be. And then they were able to answer questions that came up, and they were also able to identify whether or not their questions could be answered by one of our technical assistance providers. So it was a little bit of a two-way conversations. Sometimes you don't know what you don't know. So a developer can be describing their project plan, and someone from IFF who has done this work for years could say, have you thought about this? And if not, we can connect you with someone who works in zoning to help you think through that process. Or, on the flip side, a developer could say, I know I'm coming up to permitting. I've never done this before. Can you help me understand what permits I need and who I need to talk to? So it was a little bit of both. And the things that came up really depended on the project. So we really try to meet developers where they were, check in with them often. And for some, that was help with understanding the zoning code and incentives that were available through the Connected Communities Ordinance. For some, that was reviewing architectural drawings. For some, it was thinking about transit connectivity and how can we actually maximize the benefit of being located close to public transit. For some, it was we want to engage with some local artists, but we're not sure where to start. Or we know we need to do a better job with community engagement and talking to our alder, but we're not exactly sure how to do that.
How much did people want to know more about? You mentioned a second ago, but how much more do people want to know about transit and the connectivity issue? Obviously, half of it is development, and then the other half is transit, and that's an important part of it. But it's also something that maybe developers wouldn't be as soon as they have their site, they're like, well, we can't control what buses or trains go by here. So, maybe that's not something they focus on. But did they ask much about it?
A lot of developers chose their site because of the transit connectivity in the first place. So when we talked to them about how they made their decision about, what site to pursue, a lot of them did mention, one of the first things we looked at was, is it close to a bus or train? Once you're located there, we had some of our technical assistance providers help think about being close to transit is different than fully maximizing the proximity. And so, are there strategies? And some of these are outlined in Chicago's Transportation Demand Management Plan that was part of the Connected Communities Ordinance. But what are some ways that we can think about maximizing that benefit? And that was a conversation too. Some had thought about it a lot. Some were new to this concept of ETOD. So it was a conversation about, if maybe you haven't thought about this, but there are some things that you could think about incorporating into your project.
I imagine some folks are getting worried now about what's happening at the state level with funding from the state of Illinois. It's kind of what's happening around the country, right? SEPTA is having the problems, Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, state of California. Obviously, we've had some issues here, cities around the country having transit issues, but Chicago, I've heard a lot about more than maybe some of the other ones.
Yes, worried is an understatement, I would say. There are some incredible organizers that are really fighting for the funding that we need to keep our public transit system working. And I am very, very hopeful that we'll see some good news either some point this summer or into the fall. But like we always say, there's no ETOD without the T. So I hope we get some good news.
Do you also get a little frustrated by how, you need the technical assistance? Maybe what if there was a system there where you didn't need technical assistance because it was so transparent and easy and not overly complicated? Development seems to lend itself to being complicated in cities because of the past and history and things like that. But is there a time and place where you wish that, I wish that this wasn't even needed?
Yes, I think technical assistance in some cases can be a band aid on a broken system. And we don't want to just keep slapping band aids on a system. We want to improve the system in a way that it works for the developers that we've been serving, which is, new developers, Black, Brown developers. And so one of the things we've been intentional about is listening to what common barriers are that folks have been encountering, and then using our relationships with folks at the city to talk about what are some of the systems change solutions, policy solutions, or process solutions that could help address those common barriers so that in the future it is easier for new developers to enter into ETOD development. And I think this is both a policy question and a process question and an access to information question. So I think there are policy solutions. Chicago just made further changes to its parking requirements to make it easier to have reduced parking and put that money into affordable housing or other things. So there's a policy solution, there's a process solution. So, how do we disperse grants from the city? Is that process easy? And then there's the access to information piece, which is there's a real disparity in how much information you may have about the system if you're an established developer versus a first time developer. So, how do we make that more equitable too?
Yeah, going through the process is something that if you've done it a few times, you get better at it. And so you can beat all comers when it comes to that. Are there any specific systems that you found during this process that you're like, we need to take this down, or we need to like figure out how to reform this policy or this, roadblock?
I think one of them actually was parking. So it's really exciting to be sitting here talking to you today after having made some progress in that area. And then the other, I would say, is coordination between all of the parts of a development project. It's a lot, especially for a new developer who is probably a team of one, who probably also has a full-time job, to navigate the different departments that you interact with, within your local government, as well as all of the pieces on capital and funding. So I think one of the broader system that I saw was that a lot of this information is held in silos, and it would be great if this was a more streamlined and easier to navigate process.
What happens when you get a bunch of developers in the room together?
That's a great question because sometimes you could get a bunch of developers in a room together and they wouldn't say anything because they are competitive, because they don't want to share who they go to be their general contractor because they want that general contractor to work for them, or they don't want to share their tricks for doing X, Y, or Z. One of the things that I am the most proud of through this technical assistance program is that we intentionally built community amongst developers. And it was really amazing to see that relationships could be built between developers and they trusted each other, and they found that they could talk to each other and realize I'm not the only one who's been faced with this challenge. And if I have a question, I can call somebody who's gone through this before and they can share their experience and what worked for them. And we had so many fun stories that came out of this after 2 years of all working together. Like, for example, one of the developers that we worked with built a co-op grocery store, and they opened about a year ago, and shortly after they opened, one of their freezers broke and they were at risk of losing all of their food. And they turned to one of our other developers that operates a food pantry. They had met each other through this technical assistance program, and so they called them up and said, we don't want this food to go to waste, can we donate it to your food pantry? And so they were able to accept the food, distribute it. And I think, small little connections like that, ultimately developers feel less alone. And the impact on the community over time just by building this network, I think, is really great.
Building the network and building the housing for folks too. I mean, it's really important.
Yeah, yeah.
5 completed projects, 24 site acquisitions, 350 million invested. What are you all most proud of from this program?
I'm proud of where these projects are located. When I mentioned earlier that under Chicago's first TOD ordinance, projects were located mostly in wealthy white neighborhoods, these projects are all over the city. The developers that are leading them do not look like the typical white male developer. And that's super cool. Most of them, this is their first or second project. And then the types of projects that we built, it's a grocery store, it's housing for folks returning from prison, it's intergenerational living, it's affordable housing, community centers, theaters, dance, artist studio space. I think the impact of these projects on their surrounding neighborhoods and the fact that they're being led by people who live, work, have raised their kids in the neighborhood, I think it's just really cool.
One of the frustrating things to me always about this since I've started working on all this was just like how much good stuff is happening, but there's just so much sprawl still happening at the same time as you kind of compare that to the smaller good projects that are happening. So how do you scale something like this? Like how do you make it so that it's actually like flipped so that the sprawl developers are having trouble getting projects and they're having to have their own technical assistance, and the TOD projects are ubiquitous and easy to do and they're just popping up everywhere, and all the people that care about sprawl are complaining, dang those TOD projects.
I love imagining this world. It's great. It's a good question. I think one of the things that we have to be real about is that development oftentimes is driven by profit, and the impact of many of these projects is not necessarily always profit as, the driving factor. A lot of times the driving factor is community need and community impact. We can't measure that as well, so it's a little harder to equate them, but we can really feel that impact. If you don't have a grocery store and one opens near you, that's an immeasurable impact. And so I do think that the way we talk about this, the storytelling helps to reinforce and build the way that we think about success of these types of projects and the importance of having them in our neighborhoods.
And then you all have talked with other folks around the country that have started thinking about these things. How much have you all influenced other places? Obviously, there's the report that just came out, a national movement for equitable TOD. That was, for me, a fun trip down memory lane and some of that history section. But what do you take from the experiences in Chicago and then export them to other places, or even import stuff from, say, Austin or Los Angeles?
Right. I think one of the things is that each city and every community will have its own needs. And part of the way that we do our work is we're trying to support community driven priorities and community driven development. But at the same time, there's a lot of shareable lessons learned. There are a lot of ways that we can share different policies that are important to support ETOD. And Chicago has been part of national tables focused on ETOD for a long time, thinking about what are the policies that have worked? How do we get those passed? And what tools can we bring from our experience in Chicago to Atlanta or to Los Angeles and vice versa? And how can we show the success in one city to support change in another city? So I think that this type of cross collaboration across cities is very helpful, while at the same time continuing to honor the uniqueness of each city and what each city might need.
Was there anything specific you wanted to take away from Atlanta or Los Angeles or Austin or any of the places that you looked at?
I think we've been focused a lot on parking here in Chicago, and parking is one of those topics where you're never going to have enough research to convince the people who are against removing parking requirements. And
A cult
so,
hero could write a book and nobody would know to read it, right?
right. So I think, one of the things that we found most helpful is just the gathering of stories about places that have done this, have implemented these policies. And one, the world didn't end. And number two, it's actually more about what you're adding to the fabric of a community than what you're taking away. And so the more that we can look to other cities for these types of examples, it helps us and vice versa.
You guys have a number of recommendations in the national movement report. Is there any one that stands out to you in terms of what you need to change at the federal level, at local levels?
You know,
I know you want to have all the things, right? Like I ask these questions and I get this response a lot because I want people to pick.
what I'm going to say right now, because of the moment that we're in, is to continue to fund public transit, to think about public transit as an asset across the country, no matter how big or small your city, town, jurisdiction is. Public transit is necessary for transit oriented development and ETOD. It's necessary for us to meet our climate goals, and it's necessary for us to have the kinds of vibrant, thriving communities that we want.
Yes, it's been a frustrating kind of journey, since people started talking about TOD, about transit itself, right? And we've seen all of these cities start to build things like new light rail lines and bus rapid transit and even improving their bus networks and those types of things. But it's always frustrating to see how little investment that transit gets and then what that means for movements like yours, which, Charlotte builds one light rail line, and over a 10-year period, all the development happens along that corridor. The displacement pressures are high. The cost of housing goes up, partly because they've only funded one corridor
Right.
instead of funding a bunch of corridors. And so I think that's one thing that's been frustrating to me from all this is that we could talk about TOD all day, but part of the problem is that we're just not funding the transit to where we can build more TOD near it.
We're not funding the transit enough, 100%. We also think about transit and development in two completely different worlds most of the time. And I think it's exciting to see some transit agencies start being more interested in ETOD. And that's one of the pieces of the work that's happening in Illinois, actually, is to strengthen the ability for our transit agencies to do their own development and explicitly equitable transit oriented development. So I think you're right. We have to think about this as a whole system that includes a transit system that is comprehensive and workable and is more than being built piece by piece. And it's the housing and all of the community development and the transit that has to be built up and coordinated together.
What surprised you from this whole process?
I love this question. I think what surprised me most was how much it all made sense. Like you said, it actually is a little magical that so many people wanted to do this kind of development. It's a huge undertaking for someone. So each developer cared so much about the project and felt so excited about the work that they were doing. And to have grants from the city support this, and to have a group of incredibly talented technical assistance providers participate, everybody jumped in. The minute we asked, do you want to be part of this? They said, of course, this is really cool work. And back to our earlier conversation, the fact that developers were willing to talk to each other, share their stories, share their ideas, share their tips, it really pushed back against the idea that of what a developer, who is a developer? It's not always a corporate developer. It really can be a small business owner, a resident with an idea, and that there's a whole network of support that's out there, including city government, and everybody played their role.
How does this play into kind of larger discussions about policy that are happening around the country? You have YIMBY movement, you have the abundance movement, you have equitable communities movement, you have all kinds of ones. And sometimes they're with each other and sometimes they talk past each other. But how does this fit into that larger kind of constellation of groups that are just trying to figure out how to improve housing, to build more transit lines, to do more things that are positive? Some of them might want to do things that are negative as well. But I'm curious how it fits into that larger group of people who are trying to move the discussion forward about development and cities in the United States.
I will say I completely agree with the idea that we need to remove barriers to development, especially community development. That's where I'm coming to this from. I don't think that should be at the expense of some of the other principles that I and the folks I've been working with value. And so I don't think we should move so fast that we get rid of our intentionality around equity or certain types of regulations coming from a public health background. Some of those are there to protect our health and are there for a reason. But I think we can all agree that there are systemic barriers that are preventing the types of development that we want to see happen, and that those barriers are inequitable themselves because people get around them when they have money and when they have access. And so, even caring about being especially intentional about the equity lens, we need to think about where those barriers are working against us. And I think, the neighborhoods that we've been working with, they're better off by having these projects succeed. So I'm all for, making it easier for this type of development to happen.
Where can we find out more about the Elevated Works Technical Assistance Program, Elevated Chicago, some of the reports that you all have up, what's going on at CNT? Where can we find out more?
Find information about CNT at cnt.org. You can find information about our technical assistance program there. And then I would love for you to go to elevatedchicago.org as well to find out about the broader movement for ETOD in Chicago.
Awesome. And where can folks find you if you wish to be found?
I'm on LinkedIn, Emily Laflamme, and would love to connect with other people who are doing this kind of work.
Awesome. Well, Emily, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Jeff.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters who support this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. You can support the show as always by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Sign up for our almost 20-year-old newsletter as well by visiting theoverheadwire.com or check out the show notes for merch or other opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.